Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. And we now have the open format part of the summit. Before we continue, let me just introduce you to Professor Roger Hadcraft. He's Director of the Educational Innovation and Research, of Educational Innovation and Research at UTS. So he's sort of taking the place of Sam that had to leave a little bit earlier. Okay, in this session, we've heard a lot, by way of the presentations of the speakers. We had a diversity of views, a lot of information. But more practically, I think, if we think of innovation as an ecosystem, perhaps the role players, not all of them necessarily, but certainly the important ones would be the universities, would be business, big and small, and of course government. I mean, you can look at finance and venture capitalists and so on, investors. But maybe I can start off by posing a question to our panel, and that is, and they represent different, parts of this ecosystem, if you like. What practical steps can, first question, what practical steps can universities perhaps take to better engage with industry and vice versa? Because just before we get to that, we are both, universities and big business are both involved with technology development. Universities tend to be more on the basic side, industry, well, the whole spectrum, but more focused on large-scale commercialization. In between, there's sort of typically a gap that sometimes, is insurmountable, especially from the university side. Somebody that at the university may have technology, but getting it commercialized may just be an issue. But okay, let me put that to the panel. And yeah, please feel free, anyone. Roger,
can I leap into that one? One of the things that we're doing at UTS, which is part of that educational innovation, is we're changing our engineering and IT programs to have a much more studio experience, particularly towards the final years of the program. So I can imagine that we could run a studio where we'd bring in perhaps people from this audience to be our industry mentors, work with academics with the students around industrial automation. And every year that we ran that, it would change, because every year there'd be a different industry perspective on that. And so our curriculum just reinvents itself as it goes along. Now, of course, this is what design disciplines have been doing for a long time. But for some reason, engineering has been trapped in this engineering science paradigm, as if all the answers are in the textbooks. But most of the answers are in the heads of people like yourselves, because you're at the state of the art of where the industry is at, and that's what we need to do, is to bring that into our classrooms.
Can I ask, should that mean that universities, well, they're looking at producing industry-ready graduates, if you like, so, but is that necessary? Should universities concentrate on fundamental skills, and then, would there be, in terms of innovation, to change the curriculum takes a few years, and is that viable? Is it feasible?
Yeah, I think it's not an either-or choice. I think it's a both-and choice, that we have to do both things. That students, sure, they need fundamentals, but if you start to write down what are the fundamentals that engineers need to understand, it's a very, very long list. And some of them we do really, really well. We think that they need solid mechanics and fluid mechanics and circuit analysis and thermodynamics and all those things. But you'll find that there's a whole lot of other fundamentals that they need, but they don't get either. Fundamentals of business, fundamentals of psychology, blah, 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 blah. So you can't teach students everything. But I think that if you immerse them in enough, you give them some fundamentals and you give them enough immersion in real problems, they'll vacuum up the stuff that they need.
Good. Thank you.
Can I say something?
Yes, please.
I'd rather stand because I can see you. Whenever I get one of these, I have an uncontrollable urge to sing, so I'd better put it down. You don't want to hear that, believe me. Sorry. I'll talk about relationships from a research perspective. And And it's a very interesting issue at the moment, the connections between universities and business. I've seen it from both sides because I work in university, but I've also been on the board of 2 major companies in Australia. And the challenges are really considerable, both from the demand side and the supply side. I recently have been around the United States. I went to University of California, which is very, very good at moving technology from the university into companies, Silicon Valley and so forth. Their annual budget is $28 billion, and if it was a state, it would be the 17th largest state in America. Huge effort. You go to Stanford University, you go to MIT, and these are the universities that are put up as being the pinnacle of being the best in the class at moving science and research into business. And they're concerned they're not doing well enough. They're going to put the foot on the floor. They're accelerating the amount of connections they have between their researchers and business. We in Australia have gone down 2 wrong paths. Firstly, we've gone down the research assessment exercise path, where academics only judged by their research publications, which no one ever reads. And the second thing we've done is we've created these things called technology transfer organisations, which are actually barriers to technology transfer because you've signed non-disclosure agreements and you want licensing deals and so on and so forth. So we're doing the wrong things. What needs to change is there needs to be fundamental strategy changes on the part of universities where we celebrate and encourage industry linkages. And in Imperial College, where I work half the time, that's the best university in Europe for raising industry money, and they do it really well through building long-term relationships and partnerships with companies. Not too many. You can only work sensibly with a limited number of companies. You can't spread it too thinly. And we need to get rid of this horrible, horrible incentive system, which is you don't get promoted if you deign to work with industry. So there's a few things we need to change in that regard.
Thanks, Mark. Very valid points. Stephen, did you...
Yes, Stephen here from Engineers Australia. I was probably going to make some similar points. I think that, in a way, the great strength that we've built in Australia around education has probably become a bit of a curse in some ways because it's such a successful part of our economy now. I think there's a reluctance to really transform that in the education system in a radical way. From where I sit, see it having a very strong focus on education and research. Now, that stands to reason, I guess, in a way. But I do see us being less bold than maybe other parts of the world in terms of building capability through education. I mean, for me, that was very evident when I was in Germany and seeing so many technically orientated people that, quite frankly, seem more like bankers and lawyers than they did like engineers. And, there's Frida Siebel, the Dean of Engineering at Monash, says there's only 2 things employers are looking for from engineering graduates. It's an ability to think in a systems way and to work in teams, and everything else is just irrelevant. Yet our education systems and ourselves as a body, the accreditation body, hasn't been able to respond to that trend, and I think that's actually held us back, within the universities from effectively connecting with industry in ways that other countries have.
If I just might comment on what you said, Mark, it's interesting you say that because, again, I don't speak for 300 million Americans, but from my perspective, it does seem like that the relationship between universities in the US and companies in developing innovative technologies is quite abysmal. So it's...
in Australia, saying? Or?
In the US?
In the US, right.
Yeah, no, he was talking about Stanford, MIT, and if I look at it from the outside, having worked with German companies and German organizations, it seems like in Germany they have a very healthy relationship between developing technologies in universities and then commercializing them in businesses. And so I don't know if that's what you were saying about the U.S., how we see that in our way, but I would look more to...
claims to be responsible for 2/3 of the Californian economy.
MIT?
MIT, on the other side of the coast. So there's something going on in transferring some technology.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating to me. It seems like it's more robust, like I said, in German companies than in the U.S. That's good then, I guess. I don't know.
I'll just bring things back to basics, which I'll probably have a reputation for doing today. One of the biggest issues I think industry sees with universities is, and we spoke about it a little bit just on the bus last night, is the approachability. The connections aren't there. Yes. So most people, unless they've got graduates that can give them connections back to the university, they will never approach. They're unapproachable, massive suburbs of to an outsider, they're a hive of places that unless you went to that particular university, you have no idea who is who and where is where. And inside all those little boxes and building C, level 6, room 243, there's also somebody sitting there saying, I wish I knew what was going on out in the industry. So I think we need to get back to the basics of putting the olive branch out between the two and trying to get forums in which we can communicate.
Well, if I can give UTS another plug and pick up on the issue of internships that were mentioned earlier, most of our engineering students do 2 6-month internships, and we're always looking for partners, and that's a great way of building a connection with the university. So you'll have a student for 6 months, hopefully they'll add some value in that time, and I'm sure you'll add some value to them. Talk to me afterwards.
Okay, sorry, just one example. Probably the most successful scheme encouraging innovation in the UK is a thing called knowledge transfer partnerships, where companies are encouraged to employ graduates, and the member of staff in university is subsidised to work with that graduate in the company. It's been going for 30 years. It's been evaluated regularly, and it shows that employing the first graduate leads to more employment of graduates, and it's undoubtedly the most important conduit between the usually small firm and the university.
Okay, some questions from our audience. Yeah, we have a roving microphone.
Hello.
Yep.
One thing I'm intrigued by is the big word commercialisation and I guess the bottleneck of intellectual property ownership. Is that an issue that needs to be addressed?
Of the top 100 patenters in Australia, one is Australian owned. Yeah, we've got a problem.
So build on the stats. So I know Jennifer covered some of this as well. So Australia's in the top 10% of OECD countries in terms of scientific patents registered. Smart thinking is here. We're in the bottom 5% in terms of patents registered. Now, I know that's only one proxy for commercialisation, but it's not a bad one. What we believe at Engineers Australia, again, another stat, is that what's unique about Australia is that, and one of the risks around sort of moving into this sort of smart economy and the focus on STEM, is the number of science graduates compared to engineering graduates in Australia is 2 to 1. 16,000 last year versus 9,500. You go down the list of every single other OECD country in the world without exception. So every single other one, and the ratio is 2 engineers to 1 science graduate. You go to joints like Malaysia, they're not interested in building capability in terms of science graduates. There's a real focus on engineering capability because, you know, we're biased, but we think engineers make things happen. So that would be one anecdote. That would be certainly our view in terms of one of the barriers in Australia to commercialisation. We have this orientation, social orientation to scientists, being, inventing things, and it's, really an exciting industry to work in or sector to work in, less of a focus on the commercialisation or the engineering activity that's actually going to deliver some of those economic outcomes.
I'd just raise the point that 80% of Australian companies, or more actually, are small companies, and they don't have the money to spend on, reams of IP, legal documentation that they might be required to deal with when they do some kind of collaborative work with a university. So I think there's room for us consolidating joint activities somehow with multiple small and medium-sized enterprises around a project, and that's, I think that's where we've got to go because we are mostly small companies.
Hi, yes, I'm PJ Rosenberg from the University of Newcastle at the Central Coast, and I'm a marketer, and it's great to hear all the marketing happening today. So design, engineering, it's all about the marketing. But just to pick up on a couple of points about, my wife's German, and I've had the chance to spend some time in Germany and better understand their system, is that the word culture was mentioned today, and that when someone in the previous administration, the current government, name-checked Germany, but they thought as if you could just flick a switch and we could start having industry-university collaboration without realizing that there's a history there. And that a professor had mentioned about the incentives. And I'm one of those people in the room saying, "Hey, I've got a student who's investigating innovation activities and startups and the Advanced Manufacturing Consortium. Maybe you could help us provide a sample. So how do we connect and how do we value add together?" And I think if there are policies such for some of the programs, such as some of the German grant programs, you have to have an industry partner for a state or federal grant thing that will help spread the innovation around. And I was very interested to hear about the UK one, and I'm going to look it up.
No,
Just as Tony would say, I'll take that as a comment.
No, thank you for that.
Stephen, I just wondered when you had a chance to have a talk with the Prime Minister and he got very enthusiastic about his agenda, whether you had a chance to ask him about manufacturing mature industries. He's focused the entire innovation agenda on the support of startups and funding those from venture capitalists. But what about our objective in holding this particular conference was to question why those sort of tax breaks and incentives haven't been applied to existing companies. So we've got manufacturers out there that potentially might leave today and say, "I'd like to increase productivity, invest in innovation and automation. Am I going to get the same sort of tax breaks and incentives that these startups are receiving now?"
So the answer is no. And I'll sort of unpack that a little bit because I think, if the Prime Minister was here, he'd be equally frustrated with what I'm about to say, which is that unfortunately the whole political conversation, particularly leading up to the current election, is about negative gearing and about the health rebate issues that are being talked about. Clearly his preference, is the sense I got, is that he wants to put that conversation onto a more intellectual, more forward-looking agenda. But my sense is that he's struggling to keep his head above water just to retain his popularity, let alone actually being able to sort of debate some of these more philosophical issues that we would all like to hear governments talking about. The other big issue we talk about often is infrastructure planning, which the way infrastructure is planned in Australia is abysmal, and most people sort of would recognise and acknowledge that, recognise it's too political, but unfortunately it doesn't sort of stop it happening. So, we would argue, people like Jennifer and myself, this is why associations have a really critical role to play to make sure that we're trying to have a robust conversation about things that people, for example, represented in this room really care about. But we struggle to get to that point. So, you sit around a room of 15 people and, there's a whole lot of groups talking about a whole lot of stuff that I don't think is really material in terms of our future prosperity as a nation.
Can I add one thing? Just on the budget recently, the government put forward a reduced corporate tax rate, which will occur over time, and we're slammed for doing that. One of those, obviously, mature industries will benefit from that, and the purpose was to encourage growth. So there was something that went through which will occur on 1st of July, which is small enterprises, and now the threshold is $10 million revenue rather than $2 million. In Germany, that would be laughable. Small enterprise there would be, less than 500 employees. So it's sort of, we're still a long way behind, but at least 10 million is better than 2.
I mean, in fairness to the Prime Minister, he's only been in power for 6 months and he's done a tremendous job to date. We've got a magnificent website, and very few people would realise that the past 3 or 4 Prime Ministers have all instigated innovation statements, but none of them have put the dollars and the marketing muscle behind promoting that, and that's probably because they're in the middle of a resources boom and it wasn't necessary. What my big concern is if they happen to lose the election and that magnificent website's taken down, do we all go back to scratch again and start the whole process from the beginning?
Well, some of those things will go because they haven't been passed through the Senate. So, yeah. I can't answer the question because a lot of those things were for the future. They haven't actually occurred, you're right.
Sorry, one of the things that really were missing in Australia's continuity continuity in institutions. It's all well to talk about culture and Germany and so forth, but look at the institutions that have been there, the Fraunhofer Institutes, the Max Planck Society. Look at the ones that have been there for decades, 40, 50 years. And to some extent, the same in the UK, the research associations. We chop and change after each election. We change, and when we do have anything for any length of time, like the cooperative research centres, we're continually reviewing them, pulling up the plant to see if it's still growing, and look at the roots, And so that's one of the reasons why, we've got a Prime Minister, we're putting so much store on him, but we shouldn't have to put so much store in, because there should be this continuity that actually maintains the kind of groups here that represent particular constituencies. They need to be continuous, but they also need to be informed by impartial, good quality research and information. And that's another thing that's missing in Australia. We don't have the independent research, so government looks at this and says it's special pleading. So until we build up our research capacity in innovation, we're not going to be able to say with any degree of confidence to government this is what needs to be done.
Hello. Matt Dulce, Procentec, and I have a unique experience of seeing a little bit of both sides, and it's more about a question about universities. If this was answered, I apologize because I stepped in about 5 minutes late. There was two competing views up on the stage regarding universities and where they fit into this whole process. I believe one of the professors mentioned about why is MIT so successful, and somebody else was mentioning why is it so successful in Germany that there is a collaboration between technology and development of ideas. Coming from the US system, I actually went to a technical university, although the business school. I went to Drexel University in Philadelphia. And they were an R&D university, and as all universities in the US, they struggle to get government funding. So their innovative business model was to change the way they got funding, and they basically are self-funding. And the way they're doing that is they're taking the money from government, they do research, and then they essentially take their own portfolio, put it into a trust, and monetize their own portfolio. They say to private companies, anybody can access this knowledge, and anybody can use it, but you just have to purchase a royalty. And then the royalty is used to further fund the university and research. I guess my question is anybody even considering that? Because in Europe, endowments, so to speak, and self-funding is not something they typically deal with, and they're struggling to compete against the American universities. For example, Harvard and Yale have $20 billion plus in an endowment. It's very tough for most universities in Europe, and I also graduated from one as well. Their endowment is essentially zero. Are there any universities in Australia that are doing that, taking their portfolio, putting them into a special vehicle and monetizing them?
Well, they have financial investments, of course, but it doesn't raise a very high proportion of their total income. And we don't have the benefit of the $350 billion a year philanthropy that's invested in the United States. So although Australian universities are our percentage of direct funding from government is diminishing, and we're looking for more external sources, it's still not high by most American university standards. But I think when you're looking at Harvard, they don't actually use their endowment to invest in research. They actually win their research competitively. They use their endowment to maintain their endowment and continue to improve their buildings and so forth. But when it comes to the overall financial circumstances of university, I think we're at the bottom of the S-curve. We're still learning about how to diversify our funding, most particularly being able to emulate the success in America of raising money from its alumni.
Certainly I understand your point about Harvard, and that's a very poor example other than the sheer magnitude of the endowment that they have. But there's a lot of technical universities that are opening up all of their ideas and patents to private industry. And I guess really that's where they're starting to self-fund, because they don't have wealthy hedge fund managers like Harvard does. And I guess to any other academics, or any other universities here considering that as a model to help them get more funding for research and then develop their departments further?
I can say that CSIRO has a fairly heavy focus on industry connection, and they're monetising a lot of their IP, CSIRO. I know today people were saying it's under threat and so forth. I think there's a lot of negativity in the media about CSIRO, but it's fundamentally very strong and still going, and does have a lot of great innovations that are being developed. But you're definitely right, Australia hasn't, I don't think we've even begun that journey at all.
Yes. Fritjof Claassen. I would like to ask a rather blunt situation. Do the universities have a business model to work together with industry? Or why do you want to work together with industry? And the other question to the industry is, are you prepared, would you like to get this for free, or would you prepare to pay for that? It's rather blunt, but I think that makes it down to the point.
Well, for UTS, and I should admit to it being a recent arrival at UTS, so I'm still feeling my way. You know, we engage with industry through our internships, I mentioned, through collaborative research, and now what we're trying to do is to build much more of that into our studio learning. So we have a plan, whether you call that a business plan or whatever, but certainly part of our strategic plan is engagement is a very serious part of our business. And others could speak about our research engagement with industry, but that's not, happens to be my portfolio.
Maybe Michael from an industry.
I'd just say one thing that, and maybe this is going to get a response hopefully from down that end. The universities get beaten up a lot for not engaging with industry. And I think there are real problems in universities in their business model that we've been too pure research focused. The reason why you want to work with business in a university is because the interesting problems are in industry. And that's what you want to work on of relevance. But there's a real problem on the demand side. Australian businesses aren't working with universities. They haven't got the absorptive capacity. They haven't got the people working in the companies who can work sensibly with universities. They're not investing in long-term relationships with the university, building relationships across various levels, in directly funded research, in collaborative research, in curriculum development, in consultancy and so forth. They're just not doing it. So there's a problem on both sides.
I would like to give feedback from the German's point of view of what I've seen over the last 20 years, but
as a German, I can just say how it operates and how it works in Germany. And I don't think there's a very formalized process. It's just that students are available between the term breaks, and they just come into a company and we offer them jobs for 4 weeks, 6 weeks. They get a first intern, you know, they learn something about the business. Next term break, they come in again. I mean, we would have the same experience, and it's a good way of getting known to each other. You know, if it works out, the relationship works out. Very often those guys are getting a job when they finish university very quickly. And I think it does not start just when they are graduates and finished university, it starts way before. The second thing is, I can say, you know, one of our facilities in Bavaria, in a factory, usually the summer break, many of the workers are taking vacation, and I think during that time we have something like 100, 200 students.
20 years ago, there was, in Germany, there was a strong push to get universities work together with industry. And the first thing I learned is, when I come up in industry, the expectation was to get people. Yeah? That was the key thing that they expected. So to me, from a business point of view or from a university point of view, this is a completely separate thing. This is to do with education and with resources, but this has nothing to do with development. And then the next phase was then to think, well, perhaps the universities should create patents and get paid for that. So that's some kind of the model that was addressed over there. I also think that was kind of overstretched. The expectation was very, very high from the government. That helps. There were programs to support that. But at the end of the day, the money that comes in for the university was rather small. And So on the one hand, there are, of course, individual links that you can establish. And somebody said that already, I think. You cannot just turn a switch and then that works. You have to develop that over years and years. And the current approach in Germany, or part of the current approach in Germany, is to have, to support projects or to fund projects that are development projects between university and the company. And both the company as well as the university is funded by that government project. So that's a very effective way, and it's not research, it's development. So that's my understanding what very often industry expects. They don't want to have these high-level research things, they want to get the outcome of development. And that's, I think, a very effective way to do that. But there was, again, even in Germany, there was a learning curve in that. That's my personal experience. I'm not going to say this is the general solution or the overall solution for Germany, but in my area, that was the experience that I gained over the last 20 years. And I think we really need to avoid to mix things like people and resources on the one hand and real development projects on the other hand.
I'm Armin Fainal from ATS Applied Tech Systems. It seems to me that one of the issues that we identified, and if I can move away from university versus business, which has become a bit of a battle, I think, is really the short-termism, which was mentioned earlier. And it seems to me that we suffer badly from the short-term expediency of a political agenda. And that's true certainly of infrastructure development and very much industry policy. I'm reminded that in around about 2000 I went to a seminar in Geelong which was supposed to be looking at the government industry policy of the day, and the public servant that was at that meeting had to admit that in fact the government at that time had no manufacturing industry policy at all. So it wasn't even a bad policy or a short-term policy. The government believed that there ought not be one, and we're now paying the price for that, I think, in some ways. So I think it seems to me that as industry bodies, we need to be demanding of our politicians a bipartisanship. So rather than grabbing one in the room and trying to create a wedge and get a commitment out of one party or the other, we need to be inviting both of them into the room and demanding a long-term bipartisan view. So, if that could become the agenda that we as industry organisations push, it would seem to me that we'd have some chance of making a difference. But if we don't go down that road, we will find that industry bodies like AIG and so on keep trying to push one side or the other. So maybe just some response to that idea.
Well, thank you. I think that obviously makes a lot of sense.
I had a question, if I may. I think it's to Professor Dodgson. And he mentioned about the knowledge transfer networks in the UK. My particular interest is I'm the chairman of the Profibus organisation, Profinet organisation in the UK. So I just wondered two things. One was, are there any particular universities that stand out in that knowledge transfer network model? And secondly, I think possibly for the interest of the indigenous people here, what is the model, very, very briefly?
Well, it's about building capability in firms, usually small firms, and encouraging their connections with industry through the recruitment of a graduate and the subsidisation of an academic staff member who works on a project with that graduate in the company. There's been plenty of evaluations of this by the government and by groups like the Centre for Business Research at the University of Cambridge over many, many years, and shows the very positive returns from investing in those students. They're told, in Australia, we copied this scheme in the 1980s. It was called the Teaching Company Scheme. And it ran for a few years and then we stopped it without evaluating it. It was a change of government. As an indication of our stop-go, and lack of continuity, going back to the question there. And I think we're going to continue to have this bipartisan fight over this issue until we actually explain to the great Australian citizenry why innovation is important. Why it's important to have manufacturing in order to pay for our quality of life. Why is it important to have innovation to give us better health, longer lives? Why is it important to have innovation to give better lives to our children? Once we get people, the general public, interested in innovation and understanding it, then they're more likely to be able to persuade the politicians that this is something that they need to support, rather than just businesses standing up and down saying we need tax cuts to make us richer. It's a societal thing that we need to explain more broadly. Thank you.
Just to maybe add one word, as being involved in the organisation of this group, government was invited to be here as part of this forum, but of course with an election called, they had to remove themselves because they can't be seen to be talking about policy in the time of an election. It's actually a government policy, they can't do that. So we tried to use this forum to actually invite government to actually also be sitting up here with us, so just on your idea from down the back. And I think we need to continue that, and certainly as part of this group, yeah, we'll do what we can to try and start that conversation.
Yeah. Quick question, please, for Michael and Mark. I was really interested to hear that fact of the American interpretation of the innovation agenda compared to the German interpretation, one being from the bottom up and the other being from the top down. We're talking about the challenges of Innovation 4.0 and the digitalisation of industry, and for SMEs, they've got to get their head around that, be knowledgeable, prepared, and actually take action. Having heard that particular model, I would have thought the American model is better suited to the Australian economy rather than the German model, because it will give that support to SMEs, where at the moment the real support is being directed towards the universities and the startups and the...
Yeah, I can't recommend which model works better for Australia, top down, bottom up, outside my scope, I would say. But certainly it seems like from the discussion I'm hearing right now, it seems that there's a lot of focus on the government being involved in this innovation approach. And so clearly, like I said in my slides, the IIC, the Industrial Internet Consortium, takes a more bottom-up approach where the companies are the drivers instead of the government being the driver. Do you want to jump in? Yeah?
Yeah, I want to add something, because in Germany we're still learning with that as well. We started with it top-down, but what we announced this Hanover Fair was basically that we learned from the US guy that there must be some bottom-up. So they created, because the IIC concept is basically a lot about test beds, so creating small islands of technological things where a few companies come together and fund some activity and create a solution for that. And what they now decided, or when they kept moving on with Industry 4, is that they need to have something similar. And so they announced at Hanover Fair to create, they call it Lab Networks Industry 4, which is exactly what Fridtjof was saying, that the government has some money for projects, and they create an environment for doing those small islands of projects where they fund government, they fund universities, and especially the small and medium enterprise companies are interested to join there, because they usually don't have a huge R&D department. So for them it's a win-win, because they get some of their activity funded, they get resources from the university, which helps them with their knowledge and their people, and they get the money from the government. So they learn from the US system and now starts to implement the same thing.
And actually vice versa. If you remember from my slides, I showed the RAMI 4.0 model, and then you looked at the IIC model, which came after. It almost looked the same, right? So these two approaches, while one started one way, one started the other way, they're almost converging in a certain respect. Again, Industry 4.0 has some things in its scope that is outside the scope of IIC. That's fine, that's great, but these two approaches are converging. But again, what works for Australia, that's a tough one to say.
I wouldn't underestimate the extent to which the American government is involved in industry development. the defense expenditure in the United States has been fundamental in building Silicon Valley, in driving the defense and health clusters around Boston. Defense expenditure has been an enormous driver of American industrial performance. American policies have been extremely interventionist in so many ways. The Small Business Innovation Research Scheme in the United States, which is a procurement scheme for high-tech firms to provide products for agencies, puts double the money into early-stage venture capital than the entire private venture capital industry. The American government is the largest venture capitalist in America. So I think it's a mistake to just to assume that America is all company-driven, market-driven. I mean, just look at the iPhone. Most of the decent inventions go into the iPhone. Internet, GPS, the interface, Siri, all developed through government investments. So when we think about the Australian role, we really do have to think more seriously about how government can play a more active role and a sensible role than in the past. Our problem is we got very little money and we spread it around too thinly. We don't make decisions. Most of the funding for innovation in Australia is indirect, which means it's available to any firm that can apply for it, usually in the form of a tax concession. Most funding for innovation in the United States and Finland and various other successful companies is direct. It's targeted on particular kinds of companies. And we haven't been making those decisions. We haven't been deciding where we want to concentrate, which are our strengths and which ones we're going to build. And I think that's a fundamental flaw in our thinking about the role of government in Australia.
Hi, Mitch Giles. I've got a question sort of relating to the comments from Michael and maybe Carson made earlier. And it comes from an observation of looking at industry in Australia from my eye size, from how I see it. And you tend to see a reluctance in companies to spend and invest in assets after they've been installed. All right, so you see spend on technology not at the manufacturing side, and we're talking about automation here, you tend to see it more at information technologies. So I think, Michael, you talked about IT versus OT and IoT versus IIoT, sorry, too many I's in there. And the last comments about how money is targeted from a point, or how governments directly affect or engage with companies, but the investment in the manufacturing side at the technology level rather than at the organisation IT level, if you understand the difference between the two, one being at the commercial end and one being at the manufacturing end. I've met a lot of frustrated engineers who would like to improve and innovate, yet the dollars which are spent on innovation tend to be more on the corporate information systems rather than the manufacturing systems. So the innovation around efficiencies are not being done at the manufacturing end, rather at the organisational, how do they do their electronic data transfers more efficiently. I don't know if other people see that, but that's a frustration I've seen in a lot of manufacturing companies, and I don't know how Germany addresses that. I don't know how the US may address that.
Yeah, just I guess to answer your question, I honestly only have anecdotal evidence to go on. So we talked to a lot of manufacturing engineers, a lot of control engineers, and obviously these guys complain, as like, oh, we need more money to, upgrade our control system and upgrade our network and all this stuff. But as far as statistics, real world statistics, I'm really not sure whether in reality companies invest as much or more in IT versus OT. So I'm sorry, I wish I could give you some real world numbers. I don't know. Obviously, like I said, anecdotally, it seems like control engineers are starved for funds, but again, at a company who isn't, right? I don't know, do you have a further to that, Karsten, or maybe you see?
Don't have the numbers either. My feeling is that in Germany they do invest in OT systems quite a bit for keeping it up, but that may be because of the industries that are strong in Germany, like automotive, where they run a product for a while, then there's a new model coming up, and they use the change of the model with improving the factory, and maybe that is part of the whole story, because the innovation cycles of the product itself are relatively short, and they use the change of the product to change the manufacturing as well. But maybe you know more.
I think, we talk about, that and mix it even with the previous question, is it top down or is it bottom up? Personally, I don't think any particular model is going to influence and drive our industry. I think it's got to be driven inside out, because one of the biggest issues we have is the conservatism. And Australia is not a conservative country. We have one of the highest uptakes of technology in most areas, but in things like automation, we are extremely conservative. And yet if you asked most Australians, are Germans conservative, or are they out there taking risks all the time? They say, oh no, they're the most conservative. And yet we see they're taking big risks. They're doing, every time they do a new control system, they do it differently. They go to leading edge. They use the latest technologies. And I'm not going to talk down to engineers, because many of them are my friends and customers, and they're not all the same either. But we use a lot of cut and paste in Australia. This is the way we did it back in 1972, and we're still doing it exactly the same way. And if the people in the room don't decide to change, no government policy, no model, nowhere else is actually going to cause any change to happen in the country.
If I could just, it starts from what you're trying to do, how you're going to get to the market, how you're going to get value into the market. So Nestle sells 1 billion products a day, and not one of them is allowed to poison anyone. So quality control is obsessive, and you've got 150 countries, 180 odd factories. Absolute paranoid focus on quality. And when you've got that, then there's going to be a balance in the way you're going to invest in your information technology, digital technology, whatever. And of course, you're going to have to invest in the downstream stuff as well as in the centralization.
Okay, so maybe if I can summarize, just incompletely, if you like. If we look sort of at the initial question, sort of, are there practical steps that we as a community can take, be that from the university side, business side, and so on? I think one of the things that Chris has mentioned that stood out to me is clearly communication, like we are having today, is critically important. We can't engage if we're not sort of, if we don't know who or what we are engaging with whom or with what we are engaging with. So and that's also something that we can do practically for what it's worth. A forum, a symposium, those are the things that universities can organize, industry can do that from their side. You don't need government or an external agent to actually sort of facilitate that. So I think that's one practical step. Just looking at some practical steps that we can take right now, if you like. So, right, so that's one of the steps. I think from industry side, yes, I also, of course, industry is willing to engage, but again, the same thing, with whom to engage, and of course industry is not just going to engage just for the sake of doing that. There has to be a value proposition. So for example, at Curtin University, UWA and CSIRO in Western Australia, has sort of formed a consortium based on consultation with industry, where industry said, well, okay, the theme that they would really be prepared to invest in at this stage is big data. That's the industry feedback. So that is something that, so within that consortium, for example, there's a single point of contact, and that is made very clear to industry. You're not engaging with somebody in Curtin or somebody in UWA or somebody in CSIRO. That is the person that you engage with, and we sort of make very sure that everybody is if the engagement is with Curtin, that, or UWA, that everybody is included, that's internally, if you like. So steps like that, I think, can be taken. That's important. The government, yes. Again, that is something that perhaps this community can actually do. Am I correct? I think as a voice, that's something that can be done. And that would, again, like Marcus sort of pointed out, be very important in the long run. So there are sort of short-term and then longer-term steps that we need to take. Yes, and then of course the universities, one has to realize that internally it's not like they're sort of not doing anything. They are aware of the problems. So it is a dynamic environment. It is changing, but I think this feedback again is also very important from the university side. So Rafael, I'm not sure if you want to perhaps also...
Yeah, probably want to say some final words. First of all, thanks to the panel. That was really, really good. I think you all agree that what we have done in this afternoon was really scratching the surface. It was never going to be a solution or an answer to that one. But also what we've done is we started a conversation here. So we started to put faces to ideas. We've started to put opinions to persons. And we never had that in this forum before. What we've done in the past was always talking about technology and how great we are, but we also need to recognize that this is a lot more complex than we can discuss in this level. So for me, this is a start for things, and going back to what I wanted to say earlier, starting a network of people that work on this subject matter. So for that, I would like to really thank Chris for facilitating the discussion. Chris again for his contribution, Professor Donaldson, and the rest of the panel. Because I forgot the name, sorry. But we have a little token of appreciation for the speakers. I want to make one more comment on this one. We've been planning this for a very, very long time, and the person who is mainly responsible for doing all this is just entering the stage here. So Andrew, please come. Yeah, I really want to thank Andrew for this great work and absolute fabulous organization. And where you normally engage a complete event company, this is what this man has done by himself. So all credit to you.
Thank you so much. Here's a small gift for all our participants. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Chris. Thanks from you,
And thank you all for coming. It was great to have you here. Really pleased with the turnout and with the attention. It was seldom you had an event where it was so quiet when people were speaking. I've not come across it that often. So that meant that people were actually listening too. So thank you very much.